Alleluia, Alleluia, Alleluia.
All rise in body or in spirit for the reading of the gospel, which comes to us this week from the 6th chapter of Luke. Jesus said, "But I say to you that listen, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Give to everyone who begs from you. And if anyone takes away your goods, do not ask for them again. Do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. If you lend to those from whom you hope to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much again. But love your enemies, do good, and lend, expecting nothing in return. Your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, for he is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. For the measure you give will be the measure you get back. This is the gospel of our Lord. Praise to you, Lord Christ. You may be seated. You join me in prayer. O Lord, may the meditations of my heart and the words of my mouth be acceptable to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. So this was parent-teacher conference week for Thomas. And he's too young to know how scared he should have been about that, obviously. But walking into that scenario was like a time warp for me, and it's a total readjustment thing as a parent. Whereas once it was something you only experienced on the other side, as a student, in fear for what the teachers are going to say about you. Now, as a parent, you enter into that same scenario, just as nervous about what the teachers are going to say about your kid and about how that reflects back on you. And it's totally illogical for me to have felt that way as a kid. I was a good kid in school. There was nothing to worry about. One of my teachers even said to my parents when they walked in, they said, "What are you doing here?" And it was just as illogical for me to feel that way about walking into his Jewish Community Center preschool classroom teachers and be brought away to a different room and sat down and talked to them. But logic obviously has nothing to do with it. It's all deep trauma or whatever it is that goes and lives anew. There's something about the entire scenario that reeks of judgment, of going somewhere and being brought into, it's also very institutionalized, right? Brought into a separate room, being told to sit down. The sitting, I think, is a huge part of it, isn't it, Susan? That you have to sit in your seat across the table. There's paperwork involved. That's the other way you're dealing with a very serious institutionalized thing. All of this goes to show that there is a guilt framework that's being applied in that moment. We got to talk about guilt before we can talk about mercy. And before we can even talk about guilt, we have to talk about justice. We have to talk about what is right. And obviously, so this scenario right here, what justice is in the teaching classroom is about learning and development and progression. It's what's good and right and awesome that Thomas would day after day learn more and come more a part of himself. And that's what we want to see. And the guilt part is, are there any rooms for improvement within that? And this is guilt in a way that's okay. I mean, we're all working on improving ourselves. It's not bad. Certainly, I think my generation, the participation trophy generation, unfortunately got used to a bunch of 100% on, and anything less than that was somehow an abject failure. But we need to learn that it's okay to have some room for improvement. Anyway, and ultimately, once that is all established, there is mercy. There is this talk of, well, good, so what's the plan moving forward? How do we learn and grow? What are we going to do at home? What are you going to do at school? How are we going to benefit this child? That's the way that it should work. But I don't know if you know anybody like this, and I think you must know people like this. There is in our culture now a certain celebration of the kind of person who would go into this or any other scenario resistant to the entire thing, who would not buy in to the progress from the beginning, who wouldn't buy into the notion of justice, who refuses to feel guilty and is empowered by it, saying, I'm radically rejecting how you're going to try to make me feel. And mercy, well, it's off the table. They don't think they're guilty of anything. Restoration to what, right? If this doesn't make sense for you within the framework of this school thing, it ought to make sense within the framework of church. Because a good deal of our population, probably most of the population right now, sees the thing that we do here at church as ludicrous from beginning to end. They disagree with the guilt and say that that's something that they want no part of. And they disagree with the entire program that gets the restoration of community and the forgiveness. They don't need the condemnation, and they don't need the mercy. For our part, we brought it on ourselves to a certain extent. I mean, we certainly have been guilty about pointing fingers and naming things and saying that's bad and awful and you ought to feel guilty about that when there was no harm done. And we've been just as goofy when it's come to offering up silly solutions. But it's part of a larger thing, I'm afraid. It doesn't just involve the church. I think it involves virtually any of the scenarios by which people used to, process their lives, ask themselves what they could do differently, and then find themselves restored or figure out some pattern of renewal. If you want to put it into like a big picture narrative, how many of you have read anything about Russia in the news lately? Oh, a few of you. Okay, yeah. So virtually impossible to escape from news about Russia or about what's going on in Russia and Ukraine. But even if you thought to yourself, well, I'll escape the geopolitics by going to the Winter Olympics, no, you're going to find even more stories about Russia and bad behavior there. Really tragic this week, I thought, was the story of this figure skater, #1 ranked figure skater in the world, this Russian girl who tested positive for doping before going into the final event. And I can't help but think that that was something that really shook her confidence, because she fell twice then in her presentation. And that lowered her and kicked her off the podium. And even the head of the Olympics said when they saw her exit the podium and go and sit with her coaches, they said that the reception was chilly, and that instead of being offered human comfort, instead of being offered forgiveness or some sort of pathway, she was left out there in the cold. Now I ask you this girl is 15 years old. Do you think she just knows people who have access to performance-enhancing drugs? Do you think that she was given those? Whose fault is it that she fell that day? Whose fault is it that this is part of a whole Russian figure skating program that turns out people, and by their 18th birthday, their bodies are so broken, they can never skate again? How is this good? And who is to blame? In some ways, the interconnectivity of the world means that we're asking that question more and more. We're trying to figure out in new ways how it is we're all responsible for one another. And it's egregious when it shows up in cases like that. And you think to yourself, the system it's just failed her. It's hurt her so bad. The other place in the news, obviously, where we hear a lot about Russia is in the imminent possible invasion of Ukraine. And one of the popular things that I hear all the time news media presenters say is to say, well, actually, it's kind of our fault. We're kind of guilty. NATO continues to live even after the Soviet Union disbanded. And that's a threat to Russia. They feel threatened by that. And the promise that it wouldn't expand anymore. And there it is in Ukraine. Well, kind of. I mean, I guess that's kind of our fault, but can you blame the Ukrainians for wanting to have borders that are acknowledged and appreciated by the international community? Can you blame them for wanting to have votes that result in actual elections? Can you blame them for wanting to have agency over their own lives? That means that they want to be part of the Western project, right? They want to be part of what was birthed in the West, and they don't want to be part of what's going on in Russia. Now, Russia's story, I mean, in many ways it intersects with ours because people in our neighborhood have fled from that country. Many, many people in our neighborhoods have fled from that country, whether it is because of religious persecution or economic things. But we kind of need to understand the story of where did this injustice machine come into being? And I think it's interesting, and if you permit me just a second or two, a lot of historians have argued that the roots of perennial Russian authoritarianism go all the way back to the Mongols. Long after the Mongols have been pushed out of many of the areas they controlled, Russia was the bastion. It was the place where they continued to be able to reliably extract resources. But that's exactly what they did. They extracted resources. They were not interested at all in building culture, in developing a society, and having some sort of rulership. They just wanted to know that the taxes would come as reliably and as largely as possible. What that ended up building in Russia was so different than what we had in the West, in France, Germany, England, all of these places, just so different. The Russian system became one of control because the Mongols would just wipe you out if you didn't pay taxes. What was left were only the kingdoms that could reliably extract those resources, get them on time, and didn't take any guff. So whereas in the beginnings of the modern era, the egalitarian movements, they came out of, in the West, this relationship that nobles would have to their king, where the nobles would be required. If you were to levy an army, got to talk to the noblemen. They're the ones who have some men at their disposal. And there was a give and take between the king. You want to develop a university. Well, you got to talk to your noblemen and say, do you have some scholars? You want to build a project? Do you want to build a cathedral? Do you want to subvert a waterway? Do you want to build a town? All of those things required give and take. They required people talking to one another and agreeing with one another. In Russia, from the time of the czars, it was simply that the czar had the army. The czar owned the wealth. The czar had all the land. It flew upwards. Now you can see what's important as we move into the modern era here is that then the Bolshevik Revolution was seen as their one great hope. It was their one opportunity to finally, as a culture and as a people, actually get some power, actually have some agency again in life. And unfortunately, we all know how that turned out almost immediately, when instead of reflecting the biblical values of people's right to have their own lives and their own dignity, instead of those values that undergirded the West in our development to where we are now, Stalin reached back into an authoritarian past, and he and subsequent leaders led that country to ruin. And when the Soviet Union collapsed fundamentally, remember, by the way, how the Soviets talked about us. They didn't call us capitalists. They called us imperialists. When the Soviet Union collapsed, hope died with it. Hope for a people who now, instead of seeing their opportunity for hope and revolution, saw that die, saw themselves as being fundamentally conquered, saw the end and the return of hope. One of the famous Russian poets once said, the vision of history is a boot stomping on a human face endlessly. That is a vision of reality. I watched a documentary once that parent-teacher conferences in Russia in the 90s. And these parent-teacher conferences did not look like the one I went to. It was one of utter despair, where no teacher believed in any student, No student believed in any future, and no parent believed that any of this was worth anything. They were in a society in complete breakdown where there was no hope. There was no procedure. There was nothing. There was no justice, nothing. There was also no guilt. There was only nihilism. There was just nothing. And what I worry about is that sometimes when I see communities, even here in America, that are beginning to find themselves in that cycle of nihilism, I'm starting to see some of those same eyes in those same faces. I'm starting to worry that in our own midst, we're flirting with some of the same things that happen. And it's part of this breakdown. It's part of this breakdown that begins with us not even believing in justice, where there is no guilt, where consequently we never find ourselves in the arms of mercy. I believe that one of the most amazing things about the scriptures that we've heard today, whether they're the stories of Joseph or whether it's the teachings of Jesus or the theology of Paul, but all of it points to the same thing, that not only do we have in God the answer to this nihilism, the answer to the nothingness, to say that no, there is justice, there is right and wrong, eternally written in the first page of this book. Not only is there that, there is guilt, there is punishment for sin, there is consequences for what we do, but also that there is mercy. Mercy for us who know ourselves to be guilty of a thing, and mercy that we are commanded to bring into the world for others. And that is the key distinction, I would say, between a world of nihilism, of simple authoritarianism, the way that Putin has on display now, and the world of God's creation working through us, where instead of persecuting the other, we forgive the other. Instead of harming those who harm us, because that's what our human spirit likes to do, we ask if we might bring those people back into their human fullness, where we end cycles of destruction and begin cycles of life. I would say, in closing thoughts, so much of what this parent-teacher conference I had with Thomas was about isn't about Thomas. I mean, the chief factor that makes it not about Thomas is that Thomas is 4 years old, right? There is so much life in front of him. In many ways, what that meeting was about the future. It was about the present that we live in now and what it's going to grow into. And in many ways, we're the parent in that conference, and God is the teacher, saying, so here are the laws. Do you think we've done our best? No. Do we think we know how to do better together? Yes. And do we have a plan to move in that direction, supporting one another in mercy and building up real, true, everlasting life? We do, is the answer to that. Thanks be to God that we do. Amen.